Okay, now today we are going to focus on the lecture 11. This is regarding how we going to evaluate the alternatives for the requirements, right? And the environment and the implementation, right? So these are the areas that we are trying to cover in today's lecture. So you may have already noticed that in very first week or the second week, I went through the core processes, 6 core processes. So the third core process is basically is what we are focusing in this semester, system analysis, right? So in that core process or system analysis, also contain multiple activities, right? So we are gathering the information, right? And then we define the system requirements using various models, right? You know how to use the models now by now. And also as a part of the system analysis, last week I have discussed how to develop these sort of user interfaces or the prototypes, right, for the feasibility and for the discovery purposes. And then this week we are focusing on the other parts, right? So how are you going to actually prioritize these requirements, right? And how are we going to evaluate, how are we going to generate some kind of an alternatives for the requirements and different aspects of the project. Now we're going to evaluate these alternatives. And then finally, once we have the list of alternatives, how are we going to provide it for the management for the review purposes, right? So that's what we are going to focus in today's lecture, right? The first thing first. Now there are so many alternatives there in terms of different aspects. So one of the key things that we need to remember is the scope of the project. Now, scope of the project is very important because that actually determines what functions that we need to include in the system, right? Um, because that is very important. Because when it comes to a normal business analysis or analysis stage, we probably will uncover many more requirements and needs than reasonably can included within the system, right? So the development team must categorize and then prioritize these requirements to determine what actually need to include in the project, right? So frequently, 2 or 3 alternative combinations of the requirement will be developed by the developers along with the required resources, and then we have these so-called oversight committees of executives and the users, and then other technical managers, and they will actually decide which approach is most viable. So which alternative is most viable. So we're going to discuss today various strategies that we can employ to prioritize these requirements and selecting a best scope for the project, because the scope is important, because then of course we can actually determine the level of automation that we require to implement these functions in our application, right? um, and then of course we will discuss some other stuff along with that as well. So the first thing is we need to find out deciding on the scope, because as I mentioned before, prioritizing these requirements not only actually include the scope and the level of automation, but there are some other stuff we need to consider as well. So one of the main problem specifically relating to the scope of the problem or the scope of the project is to overcome this so-called scope creep, right? Scope creep. Now, what do you mean by the scope creep? So usually when it comes to the system development or system analysis project, at this time probably we will receive a request to add new system functions after the requirements have been defined and the decision has been finalized. So one way to help to control this so-called scope creep problem is to formalize this process of identifying and categorizing as well as prioritizing these functions that will be included in the system. So everybody in the project knows, right, which functions which specific areas or which specific business function this particular project going to implement, and then we can actually take an agreement with these key stakeholders and sign off the system functions, right? So that is something we need to identify. Now, one of the common approach that we can use to determine the scope is to maybe come up with a kind of a list of items or list of functions or list of requested business function, I would say, and then probably we can actually rate these business functions using different categories. For example, we can actually categorize, okay, these set of business function or use cases are mandatory for the system because these system use cases probably are critical aspect of our subsystem or entire system. And then we can come up with, okay, next set of use cases are important important in our system or important, but then we can come up with another set of use cases, can say, okay, these set of use cases are more desirable, right? So likewise we can have mandatory set of functions, important set of function, and maybe kind of a desirable set of function, right? So how are you going to determine all these desirability, the importance? We can actually because usually we done these thing in conjunction with the conjunction with the level of automation for the each function. What do you mean by the level of automation? How much of computing support that we can provide for each of these functions, right? So if the function is more critical, or more kind of more business critical in organizational point of view, probably we can say, okay, we'll provide more automation support for that particular business function, right? Now again, there are so many types of projects we have. Now you may have noticed that we have more predictive type of projects, more adaptive type of projects, right? So in the predictive type of project, we need to fairly well define the scope at the initial stage, right? Initial stage of the project. Because the scope decisions will decide the critical milestones that the organization project need to be achieved, right? But when it comes to more adaptive project like agile project, they actually require more little bit of maybe partial decisions at the various points during the life of the project with respect to the scope, because we can't fully define the scope at the initial stage of the project, because the scope is evolving during the project, right? So it's usually sometimes the organizations has to be very, very mindful when it comes to spending their scarce resources such as time, money, and human effort on capabilities which are very less important for the organization business needs. When it comes to the more predictive or adaptive types of project, because sometimes we tend to spend more resources in unnecessary business functions. So therefore, it is very tricky in adaptive type of projects to define the scope. So we need to be very careful when it comes to that. Okay. So when it comes to the level of automation, now as I mentioned before, the level of automation actually basically describe the support the system will provide for each function, right? What is the computing system? For the most function for an application system, usually at least 3 levels of automations can be defined. It can be a low level automation, it can be either middle level automation or maybe high level automation, right? So at the lowest level of automation, probably the application or the computer system probably provide a very simple record keeping support, right? So we can have kind of a small data input screens which allow employees or the actors to capture some information and insert it into a database. So that is a very lowest level, right? So we can have a very simple field edits and validations of input data in that particular application, right? For example, if you think lower level automation for an order entry kind of system or use case, we may have a data entry screen to enter the customer and the order information, and then the system date probably may be used by the order as an order date rather than entering by the employee, and then the employee maybe manually enters each line item for the order, right? Then the system might or might not automatically calculate the price, right? So we may need to be included, the user need to include these prices. Maybe the stock on hand and anticipated shipment dates cannot be verified by the system. So these are the things at the lowest level, right? And then the middle level of automation means, or medium level of automation probably for each function maybe means that the mid-range point of various mid-range alternative, right? So usually the mid-range alternative, so mid-range level of automation is a combination of features like high level automation and the lower level automation or alternative, right? So business, as a business analyst, sometimes we need to make a best guess of what is necessary and what is justified at the current stage of technology and within the budget. That is something that we need to be a bit careful as a business, and so justification has to be performed always, right? Need to be done always. Now, when it comes to high level of automation, usually these kind of automation occurs when the system takes over much of the processing as possible. So the user or him or herself has a very less engagement or less, processing has to be done by the user itself, right? So usually it is very difficult for a business analyst to define high-end automation than the low-end automation, because the low-end automation is basically the automated version of the current manual process. Is very easy. We just computerizing or automating what the user is doing at the moment. But generating high-level automation alternatives actually require some sort of brainstorming and thinking out of the box to create some new processes and the procedures, right? So, so we have, I don't know whether you may have the word business process management, all right? So that's another discipline whose objective is to evaluate the effectiveness of these sort of current business processes. I think you may have learned this stuff in your IBIS, what do you call INF20015 unit, business process reengineering, right? So we completely revamping the workflows into highly efficient processes. So that is, of course, require kind of a team effort, brainstorming, thinking outside of the box. Then, of course, it is possible for us to define high level of automation for a given project, right? So when you combine these things, I mean the scope and the high level of automation, probably we can come up with this kind of table. Now this is an example for Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters. So what they have done is they prepared probably event table. Now remember the event table. So event table actually lists all the required events and the use cases. So they may so use cases actually define what are the processes or what are the business functions we need to include in a given subsystem or the system, right? So they have come up with the list of use cases. So this is actually partial figure, so I haven't included, I think, the whole. And then what they have done, they categorize these use cases, whether they are mandatory, whether they are important, whether they are desirable, right? So based on their requirement, right? So you may have seen there are some functions they categorize as mandatory, some functions important. And then they define okay, what level of automation alternatives that we can provide for each of these use cases, so business functions. So they have come up with three alternatives. What is the lowest end of automation, what is the medium level of automation looks like, and what is the highest level of automation looks like. So for example, if you now it actually depends on how the direction of the strategic direction of the company, right, when you're defining this automation. For example, if one objective of the system of this particular case, Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters system, probably maybe to increase the customer support, right? So so the functions that allow Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters to respond to the customer request probably will be they categorize as a mandatory function, right? At least some level of automation, right? Because that is considered as one of the critical function for this subsystem, right? So likewise, we can actually include various level of automation for each function. Now, the other important thing that we need to remember is at this kind of table, it's actually we are not supposed to describe every characteristic of each level of automation, because supporting descriptions we can provide later on in more detail, because this is a kind of a high level of analysis, okay? Or in other words, it's a kind of overview of the function, so and the priority of each function, and then the various methods to implement each function at the different level of automation. That is what our main objective at this level is, because then we can go for we can go for more detail level later on, okay? So it has to be done very done like a team, right? We need to form the teams to selection process. And then how we're going to selecting the alternative, right? Now we have here three types of alternative. So how we going to after defining this function and prioritize this function, how we going to select the best alternative, right? So preliminary decisions might have been made based on the individual needs or the importance, right? But the entire group of alternatives usually need to be evaluated together, because to get a big picture, because we can't go just like, okay, let's take one function, this function, this function. We that is not the case in reality. We need to take the big picture to get a kind of global outlook of the this particular project. So this is actually true for both predictive and adaptive projects as well. Adaptive projects may have less detail in this point, But an overall view of the system scope is very important for any type of new development, whether the adaptive or the predictive, right? Now, as we may have noticed that nowadays the competition is fierce. So organization is trying to get a kind of a competitive advantage in the marketplace, right? And then more companies are entering into more e-commerce like ventures nowadays, right? So we need to actually manage supply and the delivery sides of the products very well, right? Um, so therefore, we need to have a kind of a more global, more strategic criteria to use to evaluate the whole alternatives to get a better picture. So what are the things? What are the key criteria we can use to evaluate these alternatives? So the first thing is, of course, as you know, the strategic plan, right? So the initial decision to develop the new information system probably frequently coming from the strategic plan itself, right? Because strategic plan says, okay, our main goal is to get more customer base in another 5 years time. So one of the key areas to develop, one of the key decisions that we need to take to develop the customer base is based on this strategic plan, right? So, so individual capabilities of the new system need to be compliant with these strategic directions of the company. So we can take this global measurement tool as a strategic plan to see whether our implemented system or the subsystem probably achieve these strategic directions. So that is very important. And then the second, of course, we need to think about the economic feasibility, because if you think about more high-level automation for a given application, it requires substantial more funds to implement, right? So there we need to have different alternatives need to be developed, and see what cost savings that we can come up with a different alternative with the different packages. So that is what we mean by the economic feasibility, because nowadays, for example, in the companies operating now in the modern environment, basically in this kind of pandemic kind of environment, economic feasibility actually is considered as one of the critical area that we need to evaluate, because accurate cost and benefit analysis is very important to determine the feasibility. And third, of course, we need to think about schedule and resource feasibilities, because it's not, I mean, if you include advanced capabilities in a system, it not only costs more, but also it lengthens the schedule of the project, right? So one effective method to minimize the immediate impact on the project is to plan for future system upgrades, right? So we can plan or we can schedule it, right? So all the commercial software developers work in this way. So we can have a kind of viable alternative for in-house development activities. And then the next one is technological feasibility. Of course, the technologies nowadays, you can see the technologies keep updating. So do we have in-house expertise to develop and implement the system which actually can go along with this new technological development? That is something that we need to consider. Sometimes we need to hire additional staff or contract with outside resources to obtain the technical expertise for the organization, right? So it is more, I think, risk averse to us to select more the alternative that do not require pushing kind of the organization more to implement the state of art system, because then of course it require more resources, more technical capabilities than the rest. So that is something we frequently evaluate when it comes to do for when selecting the alternatives. And then of course finally operational, organizational, cultural feasibilities. Because as I mentioned before, implementing a new system or implementing replacing a system with a new system is a kind of a business. It's a change in the business processes, which involves a higher risk, right? So that risk has to be managed, right? Um, as I mentioned before, if I have more scope with higher level of automation, it requires organization to re-engineer their business functions, business processes, and also the manual processes, right? Even though the benefits are substantial and dramatic, the users need to give their support for these changes to maintain that required level, because we need to have a good morale of the users, and their commitment is very important for the successful of the business. So usually, typically, sometimes, occasionally I also have experience information system staff sometimes underestimate these sort of things. Um, then of course that actually provide a stepping stone um, for any failures of the project. So likewise, when now we have alternatives for scope, we have alternatives for automation. So likewise, we have alternatives to the other aspects of the project, right? So one of the key things we need to actually key areas that we need to evaluate is to define the application deployment environment, right? So because when we develop the application, we need to deploy it in some specific area. That is what we mean by the application. Actually, application deployment environment can be, we can say that it's a configuration of computer, maybe hardware, equipment, software, and the networks for the new system, right? That's a config. So even if you think about these configurations, computer, hardware, system, software, networks, and development tool. So all these stuff also have kind of different alternatives as well, right? So there are range of because if you think about very old days, right? Very old days, we have only one application type, right? We have old days. I don't know whether you may have. We have batch processing, right? We categorize, we gather all the information during the day, and then at the night we process the information using in a batch processing mode, using more centralized mainframe, kind of using these big machines. So we store these information in a disk or a tape, and all the data entries are done in offline mode, right? But nowadays, if you think about the modern days, the IT has been very mature. Then we have a range of application types, and also we have different types of devices as well. We may have applications which operate in a standalone machines like desktop or laptop or small server computers, handheld devices, and sometimes applications are actually operated in a multi-user environment through the web servers, right? And then through the networks. Then we have online interactive application. It can operate on the wired or wireless base, right? So likewise, the complications are there, right? Number of application types have been, enormously increased, and also the variety of hardware and the variety of system software, variety of networks which supports these sort of application has been grown tremendously, right? So in this kind of environment, So we need to actually decide which alternatives we need to actually take, because these deployment environment decisions are very important for for the organization to succeed. Now, if you think about the system softwares, so we may have different system softwares, different operating system. Now, if you think about different devices nowadays use different operating systems. So we have OS, we have Android, we have Microsoft, etc. Even if you have a desktop computers, we may have different softwares like Unix or Microsoft, etc., etc. So the application we are trying to develop has to have a compatibility with the all of these things, so system software with the compatible with the hardware, etc., etc. So, and also if you think about the databases, there are so many other variety of databases, alternatives are there, right? So how are you going to choose the key aspect? How are you going to choose the best alternative for a organization is something that we need to actually consider. So all these compatibilities with the system requirements, then the hardware requirements, compatibility with the external systems is very important as well in order to proceed with the given system. And most importantly, not only the compatibility, as I mentioned before, of course, we need to find out whether it is compatible with the cost and the schedule structure, because deployment environment alternatives may have various impacts on the project cost and the project schedules, right? So if you take the one deployment environment, it totally different compared with the other deployment environment, right? And then we need to actually evaluate all these alternatives as a one one system. So if I go through one by one, if you think about developments that we have at the moment, or we have with the market. So for example, we have different, now if you think about developing the system in-house, then we have the different programming languages, different computer assisted software engineering tools, and other softwares used to develop the application softwares, right? So how are we going to choose the best suit for your particular project is something that we need to consider. And now, in order to do that, of course, we need to do a kind of a comparison. Now here in this case, our case company, Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters, they have actually tabulated all this information in a table to get a kind of an idea how we're going to analyze this and how we're going to actually improve the deployment and what else we need to actually make to implement, or do I need to change the certain things, etc., etc. So what they have done is tabulate this information like this. You can see here. So they have this is a big company, so they are processing facilities or the information processing facilities actually distributed in different areas or different cities in US. So what they have done here is they categorize the deployment environment based on the facility or the location of the particular the processing environment. And then they have decided, okay, what is the main computer hardware system they are using at the moment currently, and what are the system softwares they are using at the current. Now this is a little bit outdated, but this is how we do in a normal way. And then what are the application softwares they are currently running in each of these facilities. So based on this, we can actually we can determine what processing environment alternatives that we can have for in a different areas. So they have come up with these processing environment alternatives, saying, okay, what kind of centralized database and they require, or if they use a distributed database, what sort of distributed databases they use, etc., etc. And then, of course, everything is determined by the strategic direction of the organization, as I mentioned before. So what they have done is they analyze their strategic direction with compared to the processing environment that they are proposing, right? So what they've come up with here is they listed all the issues that they will possibly come across with the directions of the organization. So in this particular case, they are looking at more automation implemented in their system rather than the manual, because if they believe that they can save the labor cost enormously if they go ahead with in this kind of area. And then, of course, once they have analyzed this, the next step is to find out how we're going to implement. Right now, we have selected, we have different alternatives for the scope, we have different alternatives for the automation, we have different alternatives for application deployment environment. And now there are, when it comes to the implementation side, then again we have different alternatives as well. So there are various ways we can actually implement this system in an organization. So what they have done, and if you think about the ways to implement the system in a company, in a system, we have different alternatives as well. For example, we can say, okay, we can come up with alternative saying, right, we don't keep all our IS processing or information system processing in our company. We can outsource everything to outsiders, right? Or outside third-party company will take over our IT function, right? That is what we mean by the facilities management means, right? Or maybe sometimes we can buy a third-party software or package software. When you buying a package software, then there are so many other alternatives. So are we going for a generic type of package software, or are we going with more turnkey solution like some package software are more specialized in different industries, right? For example, we may have law firms, so the law firms they may have the specialized law related software packages. Or if it is a supply chain, we may have supply chain related, industry related kind of, or if it is a financial services, we may have financial services related software packages, right? So that is what we mean by the turnkey. So that we have different alternatives. Or are we going for the general third-party ERP system? So there are pros and cons on that as well. And then sometimes we can actually develop the whole system in-house, or maybe we can develop part of the system in-house and part of the system we can outsource. So therefore, we have to make a kind of a decision in this regarding the implementation alternatives as well, right? Are we going to buy it? Are we going to building it? Or if we, are you if it is if you develop it, are we develop in-house the whole part of the software, or are we going to outsource a part of the software, etc., etc. So these decisions need to be made during the implementation stage as well, right? So each of these alternatives have pros and cons. I'm not actually going to discuss pros and cons of each of these, because you may have already discussed these things in your introduction to business information system subject, right? Now the thing is this: even if you have these implementation alternatives, it's very difficult to, compare, apples with apples, because each of these implementation alternatives has different advantages and the disadvantage, and they have different strengths, different weaknesses, right? So we need to have a kind of a proper kind of a way, or more proper mechanism to implement, or to evaluate these implementation alternatives in our systems, right? So what we can do is, in this case, we can consider actually three major areas. We already considered this in during our system analysis, right? So what we can do is, we can take all our use cases, so that's called the functional requirements. We can take all our non-functional requirements, like technical requirements and other general requirements, separately. And what we can do is, we can adopt some kind of a matrix approach to evaluate each of these alternatives. Now I will tell you how you're going to use this table, because this is important for your project, the final submission. So this is what you need to do. So what you can do is, you can take, you can come up with three things, right? What are the general requirements for your system? What are the technical requirement for your system, and what are the functional requirement for the system? So we determine the functional requirement very easy, because we already have that, right? Each team member may have developed their own event tables, right? So event table actually tells you what are the functional requirements. But the main thing is, what are the general requirements, right? What you can do is, you can come up with some generic ideas. So do we have experienced staff in-house? What should be the development cost if you go ahead with that, right? What is the expected value of benefits, etc., etc. So these are the general requirements for any system that we can implement. So what we can do is, we can give a kind of a weightings for each of these general requirements. Maybe we can take a 5-point scale, right? We'll give a higher scale value for the highest important items, and lower scale value for the lowest important item, right? It depends on the system you are developing. Now this scale, or this weighting has to be done by yourself, based on some kind of a logical way. You need to think about, you need to discuss with your team members, okay? So in this case, you can see here, so in this Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters case study, they have actually categorized, they're given the weight for general requirement based on their importance. Some are considered very important. For example, have given weight very high performance record of the provider, provider of some kind of software support. They considered as a very critical for in their circumstances. So they gave 5 for general requirement for that. And then they come up with 3 alternatives. First alternative is develop the system in-house, right? Develop the system in-house. The second alternative is they buy a package, but they will slightly modify it to suit their needs. And then the third alternative is they buy a package, package number 2, or a different package, and then modify it. And then the fourth alternative is, yes, let's custom development. So let's customize the system according to the Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters requirement. And then what they have done here is they gave the raw scores for each of these alternatives, right? So if you think, okay, if they go through these 3 alternatives, they believe, okay, how important, how we can achieve each of these alternatives based on this general requirement. For example, availability of experienced staff. In-house we don't have much, so they give 3 for that score or that particular criteria. But if you custom development, we can access actually more specialized staff from other other companies. So they are I will give a kind of a weighting for 5 for that, for availability of experienced staff. So likewise, for each of these general requirement, I can actually have a kind of the ratings for each general requirement, right, for each alternative. And then I can calculate the extended score for each of these alternative, right? So extended score calculated by multiplying the weight for each item together with the row value of each alternative. So here in this case, for the first alternative, the row value is 3 and the weight is 4. 4 into 3 is 12. And the second alternative, the row value is 3 and then the weight is 4 for that particular criteria. So 4 into 3 is 12. And then the third one, again 4 into 3, and the last one 5 into 4 is 20. So likewise, then we can actually give a kind of we can come up with a kind of a numerical value. It actually, this numerical we call it as extended value. This extended value actually reflect the score weight and the row weight of the particular requirement. So once we done that, what we can do is we can take the total extended value for each alternative. So based on this one, based on this table, we can see the alternative 1 actually scores very high. So we can develop, okay, based on the general requirement, developing the in-house is much more favorable because it will produce better results for us. So this is one way. And then we can adopt the same way to rate the functional requirement and the technical requirement, right? Now, functional requirement, very easy to, this is a bunch of use cases. So you can take all the use cases that you and your colleagues have been developed and then provide the weight based on so this has to be done by the team, come up with a team. Okay, you need to give a logical explanation why you gave 5, why you gave 4, right? Likewise, you need to justify it, maybe 1 paragraph or 2 paragraph using it, because this is very important. I actually don't put a lot of effort to general requirement justification, but I'll give preference for your justification for the functional requirement, because this is where we are focusing in, right, in this subject. And then similarly, we can calculate for each alternative, what is my extended scores for the functional requirement. So in this case, you can see the alternative 1 and alternative 4 actually has the same extended score value. So likewise, we can do the technical criteria as well. How well we can develop the code, documentation, easy to installation, etc., etc., flexibility wise. So we can rate the same thing. We can similarly calculate the row score or the extended score values for each of order. So what we can do is finally we can take the grand total, right? Grand total. So adding technical requirement, functional requirement, general requirement, and take the grand total for each of these alternative and find out what is the best one, right? But sometimes it's not that easy. Now, this is a quantitative way of evaluating implementation alternatives, right? But when you're selecting a final selection, of course, we need to actually think about other factors as well, other qualitative factors. give sometimes the quantitative factors than the qualitative factors are much more serious than that. So we need to be a bit careful about when you're selecting that, because we may not have more technical savvy people or specialists in our organizations to handle this kind of development, right? Or maybe we may not have any, you know, once we deploy the system, it will be really hard to manage it, right? Because we may don't have any resources to do that. So then you may come up with a different solution. So likewise, selection is very difficult. So if you think about, okay, if you think that if you go ahead with a third party software rather than developing it in-house, then what is the next step, right? What is the next step? So the next step is we can actually solicit the vendors then we can ask them to, okay, can you please provide us some quotations? So how are we going to request the quotation from the vendors? We can actually prepare kind of request for proposal document and send it to different vendors. We call it as a RFP document, right? So this is a kind of a formal document that we can send to the different vendors if in-house development is not selected as a preferred method. So what they do is now then the vendors can bid for supplying not only the software but also the hardware and other supporting services for the organization. Okay. So how it looks like now, these are the contents that we usually put in a request for proposal document. We need to give a little bit of a background of for the project, what is the problem or what is the opportunity, etc., etc., and why we need this system, what are the advantages. So now remember that we have developed system vision document. So basically this is an expanded version of the system vision document, right? And then of course we need to describe, once we describe all the requirement, we need to describe, okay, what functional requirement, what technical requirement, what other general requirement we require in the proposed system. And then special instruction how to submit the proposal, and then the evaluation criteria, what evaluation criteria that we will adopt when we evaluating the proposals when we receive from the vendor, right? So it looks like this kind of document. So it's actually very big document. Sometimes it takes a lot of time to evaluate. And then of course once you select select a specific vendor, we can actually discuss a contract with the vendor and we can sign the vendor. So there are different contracts available when you're signing the contracts with the vendors. We can have a fixed dollar type of contract, so that is fixed. So when you have a fixed dollar contract, the vendor takes actually the whole risk of the project, right? Because if the project, if you go over on the project cost, then the vendor takes the risk. Or maybe we can have a project like cost plus percentage, like so we take the purchaser, we take the responsibility to increase the cost, right? So whatever the increased cost, the purchaser take the risk. And then we have cost plus fixed fee kind of contracts. So this is actually shared equally by vendor and the purchaser as well. So these sort of decisions probably determined by the both parties in a discussion. It takes a lot of time actually. And then what we had to do is, once we come up with a solution, we need to compile into one document. We can organize everything into one document, and then we can present these alternatives to our steering committees, and then we can get the final agreement or decision by the steering committee to go ahead with the project, right? So that is how we usually go ahead with kind of a this sort of implementation strategy.